What can we know about a church, a local church that is, from its architecture? What does the structure of a church building say about the people who meet inside, or the cultural context that a group of believers inhabits? Or, maybe more to the point, what is implicitly or explicitly communicated to people by the very arrangement of the bricks and mortar of a church building? I've been fascinated by these kinds of questions ever since getting to know someone who's now one of my best friends in the world. His name is Jack Boynes. I met Jack while my wife and I were living in Cambridge, England. At the time, Jack was studying to be an architect, but in the time we were living life with him and his wife, Jack finished his studies and began working for an architecture firm whose main business was with churches and Christian institutions. Much of the material I will use for this little excursus lecture comes from Jack and from the founder of his architecture firm, Archangel, a man named Nigel Walter. Nigel and his firm have based much of their work on the idea expressed in this Winston Churchill quote: "We shape our buildings. Thereafter, our buildings shape us." Essentially, the arrangement of the bricks and mortar actually does matter. But as a group of Christians who have devoted their lives to architecture, the folks at Archangel have taken this idea a step further. They talk about their goals in redesigning church buildings as missional goals. They want to help churches take a building that was perhaps designed well initially, but no longer serves the missional purposes of that church. Or it might be that the building was designed in a different context and a different time, and was intentionally, or perhaps unintentionally, meeting some missional goals of the church at that time, but no longer does. Let's have a look at how Archangel describes the various elements of a church building. They condense the elements of the building down to 4 categories: attention, hospitality, inclusion, and worship. And every part of a church building fits into one of these categories. They each have their corresponding icons shown here: the exclamation point for attention, the triangle for hospitality, the square for inclusion, and the circle for worship. Attention refers to the outward appearance of the building, and in contemporary contexts would also include any lights, signs, even flow of parking and driving through a church campus. A question we might ask is, how attention-grabbing is this building from the outside? Hospitality refers to the parts of the inside of the building that welcome people into it. This can range from very large spaces to very small ones, as we will see in a moment. Inclusion refers to spaces that are used by the wider community and culture for any number of purposes. There might be a small school that meets in the inclusion spaces, or perhaps a group of music teachers that give lessons on weekday afternoons, or a fruit and vegetable market that happens in the building on Saturdays. Finally, worship refers to the space we would traditionally designate as sacred space. This usually refers to the space in which the church worship service takes place. The sanctuary, where the congregation gathers to pray, sing, confess, proclaim, and commune. Now, there can obviously be some overlap in these areas, as we will see, but it's also important for us to notice if and when these areas become siloed and separated from one another. And more importantly, we should think about the theological and missional implications of those separations. What is communicated about the relationship between the church and the community or society around it by the arrangement of these spaces? 2 historical examples help illustrate this well. First, the medieval church building, particularly as it was used in Britain. It starts with a giant attention-grabbing element, which is the sheer grandeur and beauty of the cathedral building. Remember, we're talking about a time period when there was only one church in Britain, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Church of England. You can consult your church history textbooks for the pendulum swing of church power and authority in Britain from the 10th to the 16th centuries. So as the church in Britain, whatever church it was, began building church buildings, they were inevitably modeled after the historic cathedrals in and around Western Europe. These massive cathedrals would rise high above any other building structures around the city, and they could be seen from miles around the countryside. They were, in a word, magnificent to behold. One of the prime examples of these that is near Cambridge, where my wife and I used to live, is in a city called Ely. The cathedral is reminiscent, though not quite as large, as famous cathedrals like the one in Notre Dame in Paris. Their very appearance was obviously attention-grabbing. Thus the giant exclamation point under the medieval model. But then notice the very small triangle for hospitality in this model. The medieval cathedrals had very small atria that served as an entryway into the building. There was often not enough room for more than a few people to stand at one time, and their primary purpose was to facilitate people going from outside the building to inside the building. A very practical concern, of course, but not one concerned much with hospitality. In fact, some of the magnificent cathedrals built in the medieval period had rather small doorways. Again, perhaps implying that it was more important to see the magnificence of the church than it was to enter into it. But if one did venture from outside the building to the inside, one would find what we see here modeled, that the elements of inclusion and worship completely overlap. In fact, in most medieval church buildings, the exact same space would be used for an indoor town market during the week and a worship service on Sunday. The space where people knelt and prayed and heard the scriptures read and received communion was the same space that held stalls selling produce or cloth, or where the edicts from governing authorities were delivered and read for all to hear. This is a good example of the development of the church as a social institution. In this era, the sacred and secular inhabited the same space. And this was largely due to the fact that the church held a great deal of social and political power and influence. It was also due to the fact that the church held a great deal of wealth. The medieval cathedrals were the largest buildings in any city where they were built, because it was exorbitantly costly to build buildings of that size. But this all began to change in the 19th century in Britain, during what is known as the Victorian era. The cathedrals still stood, of course, through the 19th century, and most are still standing even today. But as new church buildings began to be built, sometimes in larger cities, but also in smaller towns, the architectural trend shifted to a model that included two separate spaces, one for inclusion, societal functions and cultural gatherings, and one for worship, the sacred functions of the church. As you can see in this picture model, this architectural trend created a physical barrier between the church space and the society space. This was a natural result of philosophical trends during the Enlightenment that began to sharply distinguish between the sacred and the secular, quote unquote. The trouble with this from a missional perspective is that there is no way of facilitating movement between the worship and inclusion spaces. And according to the architects at Archangel, this is one reason why many churches began to see their memberships decline during the Victorian era. People who were not already integrated into the worship of the church began to interact with the church space as a purely social site. Now, Archangel seeks to help churches repurpose or renovate their buildings to reintegrate the elements of attention, hospitality, inclusion, and worship. This can be seen in their models 3A and 3B on this slide. Nigel and his fellow architects have taken their missiology and applied it to the physical buildings. They recognize that one effect of the Victorian era is that people who are not part of the church already have some difficulty and hesitancy at stepping into what they've come to know as a sacred space. So a simple return to the medieval model of complete overlap of inclusion and worship ideas without an element of hospitality would be ineffective in our 21st century context. Instead, what is needed is an architectural model that gives relatively equal weight to the four elements, and a model that integrates and overlaps the spaces without collapsing them into one. So you can see in both missional models that a good attention-grabbing edifice at the quote-unquote front doors of the church leads to a dotted line entrance into a space dedicated to hospitality. This is a reaction against the small and closed entrance doors to the magnificent medieval cathedrals and the relative lack of hospitality as a value in both medieval and Victorian architectural models. Then the interior architecture integrates the spaces of hospitality, inclusion, and worship in ways that provide for easy movement between. The idea here is that someone who is completely new to the church might find themselves comfortable in the hospitality space, and therefore they might be curious about the inclusion and/or worship spaces of the building. And if there are relatively low barriers or thresholds between these spaces, then it doesn't take a big psychological step to venture into a space beyond the front doors of the church. Now, all of this is interesting food for thought, especially as we step in and out of church buildings on a weekly basis, many of us. Next time you are at your church, take a look around. Ask yourself where the attention, hospitality, inclusion, and worship spaces are in your building. Does it matter where they are? Can you see any intentionality in how they've been arranged? Can you recognize difficult barriers in the space that might prevent someone from being curious about the worship space? Since meeting Jack and Nigel and having conversations with them and their fellow architects, I have to admit, I haven't been able to look at church buildings the same. I kind of hope you won't be able to either.